Well, good morning. Thank you all very much for joining us. It's a real pleasure to welcome you. My name is Mara Jano, Dean of the School of International and Public Affairs. Liza Mundy of the Center for American Progress, who was identified as today's moderator, unfortunately couldn't join us. So I have the pleasure both of welcoming you and also of moderating our discussion. And we're really very happy at SEPA to co-sponsor this event with the New America Foundation, and very fortunate to have with us Anne-Marie Slaughter, former Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, former professor at Harvard Law School, and former director of the State Department's Policy Planning Department, and now president of the New America Foundation. Our own Debora Spar, who's, of course, president of Barnard College, where she's been a great proponent of women's leadership and education, and an expert in international political economy and emerging markets. Professor Spar was previously a professor at Harvard Business School and senior associate dean for faculty research and development at HBS. So thank you very much for being with us. And Alison Wolfe, who is the Sir Roy Griffiths Professor of Public Sector Management at King's College in London. Alison Wolfe has been a specialist advisor to the House of Commons, Select Committee on Education and Skills. She's written widely, and in March 2011 completed the Wolfe Review of Vocational Education for the Secretary of State for Education, and was awarded at the Queen's birthday in 2012 a CBE for services to education. Congratulations for that, Alison. So let me share with you what stimulated me to organize today's event. I would say there were two reasons. First, we have with us today three remarkable scholars and thinkers, each of whom have made their careers around professional and intellectual pursuits that have not been focused on gender and employment matters. Yet each has, at this point in their lives, chosen to devote themselves and write major works addressing fundamental questions around middle-class educated women and work, families, life choices, and how societies and professional environments are and are not changing. Anne-Marie Slaughter, after writing hundreds of legal and policy articles, wrote what she once referred to, and I've heard others refer to as the article, in the Atlantic last year entitled "Why Women Still Can't Have It All," that truly went viral. I never liked that term, but it really was meaningful in her case, and really has contributed mightily to a debate underway in the United States about managing the demands of work and family life and continuing obstacles to genuine equality. And I think Anne-Marie is now in the midst of writing, or maybe has just completed writing, a book that will build on these issues. Alison Wolfe has just published this month The XX Factor, How Working Women Are Creating a New Society, which has just come out, and this book really rigorously examines the economic rise of some women and perhaps a gulf that exists between well-educated and other women. Debora Spar has written and just released in September an important and engaging book entitled Wonder Women, Sex, Power, and Quest for Perfection. And not with us in person today, but I feel part of our intellectual background and engagement around the issue of women and work in the United States is, of course, Sheryl Sandberg's book Lean In, which has spawned a movement around the United States at American campuses around the issues that she identifies and the advocacy she is advancing for women to be more ambitious and resilient. Our own SEPA faculty member, Sylvia Hewlett, who could not be with us, has also recently published a book called Finding a Sponsor. So why are these books being written by these women who are leading thinkers? And are we in a kind of post-feminist feminism, and what does that mean, if anything? So a second reason why holding this discussion today, I think, is closer to home at SEPA. Last year, we inaugurated a gender specialization in our curriculum. I think the head of the gender specialization, Yasmin Ergas, is here with us today, and I thought today's discussion might help us think about some of the issues that could be relevant to our own work. But let me start with just that brief introduction by inviting each of our very distinguished speakers to say what has inspired you to write about women in work, and what is the main message of your new books and forthcoming book. And if I might invite Alison Wolfe to start us off, and then Debora and Anne-Marie. Right. Please join me in welcoming them.
Well, I'm going to stay here, so can everybody hear me okay? Yes. All right. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Merit very, very much for inviting me to talk. It's great to share a platform, and I think that we should have some fantastic discussions. And I want to start with saying a little bit about where I came from and how, in a way, I think being in London made me look at the world rather differently from if I'd been in the US. Merit said that I got a CBE. A CBE, for those of you who very recently haven't the faintest idea what a CBE is something called a Commander of the British Empire, which is a bit of a joke because we don't have much empire left. But I think that what is true about modern London is that it has become more and more international and has attracted more and more highly educated people from all over Europe and the world. And the job that I do and the work that I do, which is very much looking at labour market and education issues, makes one very aware of it. And I started not with anything particularly in my own life, but with a bit of simple arithmetic. And the fact that there are now actually over 70 million, but 70 million when I wrote the book, highly educated, highly successful professional women in the world, 70 million and rising. And that many of the very successful professional women that I knew came from developing countries, not from the developed world. So that was sort of it was that critical mass that first made me think, this has probably changed the world. 70 million people is a lot of people. This is a very, very different world from that of my mother, let alone of my grandmother. And then two very specific questions that were posed to me also took me a little bit further. And one of them was from an editor for whom I write quite often, who said, now that you don't need to have kids to have a pension, why do people have kids at all? Which was an interesting question. And the second thing was actually a commission, something I pitched for, to look at voting patterns for a BBC programme. And one of the things that was very interesting there was that everybody knows, or doesn't, that women vote differently from men. And if you sort of know politicians, you'll discover that a lot of them believe that the way to attract the woman's vote is to have female candidates. And so I started sort of, first of all, thinking about marriage, and secondly, looking at voting patterns. And looking at voting patterns very quickly brought me up short, because actually there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that women vote for female candidates. Like, no evidence at all. They don't. They vote for people who are responding to their interests. But what that then brought me to, and I think this is the real point about my book, was that with a world where there are so many successful professional women, it makes less and less and less sense to talk about women. That what has happened because of the opportunities we've had is that women are now no more homogeneous as a group, really, than men are. It used to be that the most important thing in your life was whether you were a woman, if you're a woman. Making a good marriage was the thing that decided your life. And that is no longer true. And when you start digging into how women vote, you discover that women vote like everybody else according to a whole cluster of things, what they worry about, what they're interested in, and that they're, just as for men, their patterns have shifted and they vote according to very, very different interests and groups. And then when you dig a bit further into this, you then realize that one of the things that has happened is that as women have become more diverse, what has actually happened is that the top 15 to 20%, the top group, people like all of us in this room today, have become more and more distinct. The women in that group have become more and more like the men in that group. They marry each other, obviously, and they work with each other, they work for each other, they boss each other around, and they work in mixed gender groups. Whereas the vast majority of women still lead much, much more traditional lives. They work in overwhelmingly female workplaces. They work much more often part-time. They're far more likely to drop out. They have their children at different times. They get divorced more often. They lose their virginity at different times. There is just this growing gulf between these two groups. And so the book is very much about the worldwide emergence of a really large group of professional women and the impact this has had on the labour market, on marriage patterns, on the way families do and don't succeed, on family businesses. So I came at it very much from a couple of sort of interesting academic questions. But I suppose the other thing that was very striking to me as I wrote it was that, first of all, I came to see the world differently, so that when I walk around the street, I see the world differently because I've written that book. But I suppose I also became more and more aware, first of all, that a lot of this was my own story. You know, obviously, in a sense, I knew it. I knew I came along post the opening up of most jobs, post-pill, post-easy divorce, post the equalising of access to the top universities and schools. But I don't think I had realised until I wrote this book how much what I had done had been, if you like, just in time, and how much it was it epitomised a very distinct, completely new chapter in human history. That it's the first time ever that we have had these integrated elites. And the other thing that I had not realized until I started looking was how much faster it was happening in the developing world than it had happened in the West. Now, you know, I mostly write about the West because that's where you get all the good data from. You know, you go online and you just get much, much better data. And, you know, thank you to the US particularly, though ours is pretty good as well. But actually, the Indian data is quite good too. But what was really striking was that these values had come much faster. And we tend to be aware of the places where girls are still persecuted and where they have very little opportunity. But what is very striking if you compare developing countries today with Europe and the US at comparable levels of income is how much faster that change is coming. How much more quickly it is happening in the rest of the world. And one of the statistics that I have in the book, which everybody is struck by and is absolutely true, is that, you know, half the self-made female billionaires in the world are in China. Okay, China's big. It's also very poor. And this is something which is utterly extraordinary if you know anything about Chinese history and attitudes to women. So I became very aware of that. I did become aware, of course, as I always had been, and I know Deborah and Anne-Marie will talk about this, that of course there are tensions, of course the choices are not always easy. But the thing that became most apparent to me was that this was a worldwide movement. It was a worldwide trend. It was a shift in values. And that one of the results of it, and this I suppose is the downside to all that's fantastic about it, is that the elite, the 15%, the top, women and men and women, lead very, very different lives that are increasingly different from those of the rest of society. And one of the things which I hope people will take away from the book is not just the details of this, how it's happened, the dynamics of it, the fact that we haven't begun to see the end of it, but also the fact that for a lot of people, it is very different. It's a struggle that many people are, to put it bluntly, as I say, part of the new servant classes, not of the new elite. And that if we are going to deal with this and create societies that are as good as we can manage for everybody. As a dead compatriot of mine said, and it's still one of my favorite statements, knowledge is power. You want to change the world, understand it first. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. Deborah, please.
I should just start out by saying I think this is a great question, and I'm always personally deeply intrigued by why people write the books they write. And I'm sure we have quite different stories, although we've written somewhat similar books. And mine is a fundamentally different story from yours. I'm afraid it may come across as a more shallow and superficial story, but I got to go with what I know. So I never planned to write this book. This was not the book I was supposed to be writing. I finished my last book in 2006, which was called The Baby Business, and it was an analysis of the market for reproductive medicine. And as is always the case with me, when I come off one book, I enter this sort of phase of book postpartum depression, where I'm not writing anything and I'm sort of tortured by not writing anything, and I sort of have to latch on to another book topic. So I had decided to write a book on the global water market, which I know seems a little odd after babies, but the basic argument was that in some odd ways, I was at Harvard Business School at the time, so you'll see the market perspective, that babies are like water, in that they're both deemed to be so valuable that you can't put a price on them. And so you wind up with a very distorted market because you have a product, if you will, that is essentially priceless. So I was sort of assiduously going along, writing the water book and having a great time with it. And then it slowly started to dawn on me that I was being asked repeatedly two of the same questions. The first was more of a request than a question. It was, and I'm sure every woman in this room has had this experience multiple times, when someone would call you up or send you an email and say, I really hate to do this, but we're having a panel, a conference, whatever, and you'd be fabulous, and we really need a woman. And I reached a point where I said, if anybody puts that clause in a request to me, it's just an automatic no. But I was getting it constantly, which of course made me realize what should have been more obvious earlier, which was I was the only woman in the room. And if they needed a woman to pretend to other people that there actually were women around, I was kind of one of their few options. So I got increasingly upset by this request. What I also started hearing more and more frequency as I rose sort of higher in my own career was, Deb, we need you to solve the women's problem. And this always came from very well-meaning men who would call me into their office and say, Deb, please just solve this for us. As if there was this little switch on a wall that I could kind of flick and solve the, always in quotation marks, the women's problem. And so essentially being, sort of somebody who likes to please, I agreed on several occasions to try to solve the women's problem. I was at Harvard, so this was sort of generally the women's problem at Harvard, which I should say is no different than the women's problem at Columbia or Yale. I won't talk about Princeton because maybe they've solved it. But, it's this sort of general problem that we face in elite society. And so but what it forced me to realize was that there really was a women's problem, and that I had no idea how to solve it. But the women's problem that became increasingly evident to me related back to the first issue. There were no women. And I looked back sort of retrospectively at the women I had gone to college with who were equally smart and determined and ambitious. And sort of 25 years on, most of them weren't in the workforce. I looked at the women who had started at the same time as I did at Harvard Business School on the faculty, and they hadn't gotten tenure. And I'm sure many of you read the article in the New York Times recently, they're still not getting tenure. And perhaps most worrisomely of all, I looked at my students. And by this point, I had been teaching for over a decade at Harvard Business School. And, I had taught some of the smartest, most ambitious, most competitive young women on the planet. And they were having fundamentally different careers than their male counterparts were having. So it became glaringly obvious to me that there was a real women's problem. And here's sort of the superficial part. I should have figured this out decades earlier. But perhaps, like Alison, I was born at a moment in history where I sort of grew up believing that there was no women's problem anymore. I was born in 1963, so right when feminism was really exploding. But by the time I became politically and socially conscious, it had happened already. And so I think many young women of my generation, particularly if we were white and straight and well-educated, really grew up believing that the world was our oyster, that we could be whatever we wanted to be because everyone was telling us that. Whereas even a generation earlier, a smart mother would have said to her daughter, well, you're very smart, but, most important thing for you to do is find a nice man and settle down. My mother and millions of mothers like her across America and Europe were saying, you can be a Supreme Court judge. You can be an astrophysicist. And, quietly she was also saying, but make sure you marry a wonderful man who's smarter than you are, which leads to the problem. But I grew up believing that, of course, I would have all these things and that women could do whatever they wanted. And it really wasn't until I started noticing that I was the only woman in the room that I realized that there fundamentally was a women's problem. So I started messing around with little bits of a book that I was calling at the time Confessions of a Reluctant Feminist, which is actually the right title for this book. The title changed when several years later I had to sell the book and was quickly told that you could not publish a book that had feminist in the title because nobody would buy it. And so if you notice now, my book now has sex in the title, which turns out to be much better for marketing purposes. But just to complete this slightly odd story, around this moment, I also made a huge career change, and I left Harvard Business School to become the president of Barnard College. And so all of a sudden, I moved from a very, very, very male environment, a place that was just flooded with testosterone, to a very, very, very female environment, whereas I badly say all the time, you can't find testosterone with the search party. So it's, they're just fundamentally environments. And what it gave me the ability to do, I think, was to think about what these differences were. Are there differences between places that are run by or at least dominated by women and places that are run by or dominated by men? And I fundamentally think there are. And I've had, I think, an interesting lens in being, to some extent, at the two extremes, or two of the extremes of this spectrum. So the last piece of my strange story is I was still writing two books. So I was writing the Water book, and I was writing the Confessions book. And I was smart enough to realize that, given my day job, 2 books at a time was probably not a wise strategy. So I was lucky to have had lunch one day with a wonderful Barnard alum who was one of the leading publishers in the city. And I said, okay, I'm tortured right now. I've got to figure out which book to write, and I just don't know which book to do, and I've got 1 day a week to write. What should I do? And you sort of have to imagine this woman who's a classic New York editor with big black hair and this sort of streak of white and constantly smoking. And she said, don't write the Water book. And I said, but the Water book is such a good book, and I'm halfway through with it. And she goes, don't write the Water book. I said, I got 42 people writing Water books, and you're not one of them. You're at a girls' school, write the girls' book. So that is actually the story of why I wrote this book.
Thank you. Now, Anne-Marie has a book just about to come out.
So I explained why I wrote the article in the article. But I'll elaborate a little here, and I'll jump off of Alison's point about the divide. And Alison describes the divide between elite women and mass of women. I thought, I'm 5 years older than Debora, so feminism was still happening for me, and I always called myself a feminist. I was proud to be a feminist. I still am. But I definitely grew up thinking there were 2 kinds of women. There were the women who put their career first and who are going to remake the world, and then there were the women who put their family first. And as I watched all these women fall off the track, I thought they're just not as committed to their career as I am. And I thought, they really had different values, and I could not imagine not putting my career first. Just could not imagine it. loved my family, adored my sons. I would say they were the most important thing in the world to me, but if you'd ever said, you've got a choice between a job you are dying to have and your family, I would have said, no, I'm going to make it work. So what happened was, first I left my job at the end of 2 years when that's a normal period to be in government, because I needed to, because my son really needed me to be home. But then the real change happened. It wasn't leaving Washington to go home. It was after that realizing I'm not going to put myself up for another foreign policy job in this administration, even though this is the time when I should be expected to go as far as I can go. It's my party. I thought I'd go into government in 92. I got tenure. In 96, I had a baby. In 2000, well, whoops, not my party. In 2004, whoops. So this was my moment. And realizing I just can't face the idea that I'm going to look back at the end of my life and have missed the last 5 years my sons were at home. I just can't do that. And that was a revelation. And once that happened, I didn't see that divide anymore. I suddenly looked at many, many, many of my friends who had made different choices along the way and saw not different priorities, but a system in which they wanted to be with their families and their jobs did not allow them to fit the two together. So I suddenly saw it not as a woman's problem, but as a work problem, as a social problem, as an economic problem, that in fact, like in my world as a professor, I'd always been able to put it together. And even as a dean, I could put it together. If you're the boss, you can put it together. But as a government employee, this wasn't about my job. I mean, I was at a level where, no, you have to choose. You either have to be on 24/7 or not. That was a personal choice. But that for so many millions of women, it wasn't about ambition or commitment. It was about being up against choices because of the structure of our workplace, our expectations about what commitment to career means, which is effectively, being there all the time. So that's what, caused me to think about writing the article. What convinced me was talking to these young Rhodes Scholars, because I was raised to think you can't say you can't have it all. You just can't. That's not allowed. That's breaking the taboo. But when I was talking to this group of Rhodes Scholars who were as talented as I could possibly imagine, and I kind of blurted out my own personal story, they said, you have to write this. You have to put this out there. And at that point, and Merritt, we were talking about this before, I made a very conscious choice that I knew if I wrote this, people would pay more attention than if somebody like Joan Williams, who's actually written a lot of this, who wrote Unbending Gender, who's spectacular and has been, or Sylvia, there are any number of women who've been writing similar arguments for a long time, but because they do gender studies, because they're in that domain, they are discounted. Whereas I knew, as somebody who'd made my name in foreign policy, people would pay attention differently. So let me just then describe what's happened since. So I did choose to write the article. I did not choose to devote my life to this issue. I really didn't. I had no idea that the article would have the impact it did. You just couldn't imagine it. I thought, well, I'm writing an article for The Atlantic, and, the people who read The Atlantic, that's not a huge audience, and this is one article. And so, but since then, I've given probably 130 speeches in the last year to every conceivable audience of women, from investment bankers to community college faculty to human rights workers to diplomats. Really an extraordinary array. And through that process, I have come to see a whole lot of issues differently. I've come to see, for one thing, the different feminisms, right? Every time I would advance my arguments, somebody in the audience would say, well, that's not the experience of African American women, or that's not the experience of lesbian women, or that's not the experience of women who are the first in their families to go to college. So I've come out of that and doing a lot of reading, actually not seeing this as a women's problem. I no longer see this as a women's problem. I see this as a problem of not valuing care, not valuing the work that women traditionally did, where Alison says we all were once defined by the fact that we got married and we had children and we cared for them, or we cared for our parents, or we were supposed to take care. We as feminists were taught to devalue that, which made sense. I mean, we were trying to, break into power positions, so we valued what Dad did and we devalued what Mom did. And men had always devalued what Mom did. So we reinforced the devaluing of care and the valuing of competition and breadwinning. And now we're in a situation that because we don't value care, if you take time out to be a caregiver, as a man, woman, or as a man, you're penalized, right? If you take time out, you are not going to be on leadership track. You can do it. You can still keep your job, but you're not going to be at the top. That's at the top. You're penalized for taking care. At the bottom, if you are the sole breadwinner and caregiver, you're going to fall. Your chances of falling through the cracks are far greater, right? The same reason we have too few women at the top is the reason we have too many women at the bottom, and they're called single mothers. They're single fathers too, but there are many fewer of them. And along the way, we have no infrastructure of care. We have no way of supporting caregiving, and this is not just for working mothers. This is elder care, caring for those you love, whether it is a spouse or a sibling or a parent or a child. We don't value that part of us. So I have come out of this, an unlikely spokeswoman, perhaps. I mean, I've always been a feminist and been proud of it, but someone who actually, through my own experiences and then through just looking at this through my own lenses, now sees this not as it is a feminist issue because women are disproportionately impacted, but I don't think we can fix it unless we look through a very different lens.
Well, thank you so much. Let me ask one more question before I open it up, and this is a bit of an overcharacterization, but I think both Debora and Anne-Marie have emphasized the fundamentally different careers and lives that women lead as a result of really biology in large part. But I think what Alison is emphasizing is the similarity between so-called elite women and elite men that has divorced a bit from biology. And I just wonder if you would all engage a little bit this question of the relationship between biology and the reproductive function, if you will, and careers, and what you think needs to be done about it in a practical way, if anything. You can start us off.
Okay. Well, in a practical sort of way, I actually have one very simple piece of advice, which I know most people will not take, which is have your kids young if you're going to have them. Because then everything else is you're going to live till your mid-80s, probably at least, and that will then sort of
I say that
give you
too,
time.
yes.
No, nobody will take. However, I also want to make another much more fundamental point, which is that, of course, a lot of people don't have kids, men and women. The reality is that a very large proportion of graduate women all over the world, for all sorts of good reasons, because you don't meet the right guy or you make a career choice at a various point, don't have children, and an equally large proportion of graduate men don't. So this is again about men and women. That among it's about the top 15%. I mean, I think Anne-Marie and Debora have talked about the importance of paths to the very, very top. And you're talking really about the 0.5 or even 0.1%. I'm talking about the 10 to 15%. That's where those 70 million, 75 million, 80 million people are. And there, I absolutely do think that what is, to me, most striking is that for that group, the lives of the men and the lives of the women are more similar than they have ever been in the whole of human history. And it is nonetheless true that women are usually the one, when there is a child, they're nearly always the one who decides to scale back, or not among that group usually to stay home. Only the very rich stay home. And in the rest of the society, you can't afford to stay home, mostly, so you take a part-time bit. But I think that there is a difference, and it's a difference which is obviously tremendously important often at the time. But I think it's also worth emphasizing that, yes, it's true, if you're doing one of the really, really top jobs, then you are on 24/7. But most really good jobs, most of the jobs that the world would love to have, are not actually 24/7. They really aren't. And the other thing that I think is a big plus is that there is, again, very clear evidence that although, on the whole, in most families, that women do rather more hours in the house and rather few hours out of the house, the number of hard working hours that men and women put in all around the world is equal. It's not that one group is working harder than the other. It is that there is, in certain families, a shift, but that actually in today's world, not only are we opening up that top 15%, maybe not the top 0.1%, but that top 15% is now 50-50 in the developed world, male and female. But that actually, yes, something good has happened. Relationships between men and women have changed in many ways. And I'm not saying that in most houses the husband is doing the laundry, but a lot of the husbands are. And if you look at the total number of hours, they are equal everywhere, and that includes Japan. There is one exception. Gosh. Italy, the women are housework crazy.
So I'll disagree a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, I fundamentally agree with your overarching point that perhaps the most important divide is not in terms of gender, but is in terms of socioeconomic class. And I think pointing out the elite, which is different than the uber elite, is really a crucial point. But as I say in the book, I do think that even if biology is not destiny, it's probably not something we should overlook. And I think I say this in part, having written my last book on reproductive medicine. So there's amazing developments in the field of reproductive medicine, but women still have the babies and men don't. And that's not going to change unless we get far, far more advances in the pure technology. And I think we have to address more explicitly the differences that come from physically carrying and giving birth to a child. And it's something that the workplace is fundamentally uncomfortable with even talking about, because it just raises all of the yuck factor. Yet, and I begin my book with a very uncomfortable story of pumping breast milk in the ladies' bathroom at LaGuardia Airport. And every one of my male friends who read the book in draft form said, please do not start with this story. It's making me very uncomfortable. Every woman who read the book said, this was my life. And I'm getting, most of you in this room are probably too young to have experienced this supreme joy. But, it really is, there is something about these horrible breast pumps that forces women to grapple with this choice. I'm working and I have a baby. And I want to take care of my baby, but I have a job, and that's why I'm sitting in the ladies' room with a breast pump. And it's an incredibly visceral moment that every working mother is going to face, and which no working father will ever face. And one of the really interesting reactions I've gotten to the book is a number of lesbians have come up to me and said, even in lesbian couples, the woman who gives birth to the child falls into a different role just because of the physical connection she has to this child. And of course you can say that, this moment of breast pumping and breastfeeding doesn't actually last for very long. But it does set up, I think, what in our old field we used to call path dependency. That if you are the primary parent for those critical 6 months or 2 years, routines get established that just make it much more likely that whoever gave birth to the child will take on more of the child care. So I think we need to at least talk about this more freely. There's one very, very simple policy piece that comes out of this. Lactation rooms. Make it easier for women in the workplace. This is a very, very simple thing. But I think the other part of biology, which we just have to grapple with, is that sexual attraction in the workplace exists. And now, it doesn't have to be male-female. It can be same-sex as well. But this, too, is something I think we don't talk about. We talk about sexual harassment, and virtually every workplace now will have policies about sexual harassment. What we don't talk about is just sort of the general level of discomfort that many women, particularly young women, still feel in the workplace. We don't talk about the fact that so many men are so terrified that they will behave in an inappropriate fashion that they will never be alone with a woman in the workplace, which means that those women are not getting the mentors that they need. They're not getting the sponsors that they need. They're not having the experience going out for drinks that is going to be a part of their career. So I think just to come full circle on this, I don't think biology is destiny here. But I do think we ignore it at our peril. Because the good news is that we have come a huge way, and back to Alison's point, we've gotten rid of most of the obstacles to women's advancement. But the ones that remain, I think, actually stem from the biological differences, and I think we need to feel more comfortable talking about them, or we'll never actually close the rest of this gap.
Wow. So I agree in some ways and disagree in others. And my own thinking has really shifted here. So in the article, I said, I don't know if it's biological or sociological, but my experience is that women feel guiltier than men do when they leave their children, which I still, just as an empirical statement, I think it is true, although many men have wrote in and were very angry about it. I have come to believe, however, that is much more sociological. I actually think that, and we've got some biology to back this up, it is about bonding with the child early. But there is evidence now that if the man takes care of the baby from the beginning, hormonal changes happen in his brain that are very similar to what happened in ours. And if you take Debora's point and say, yes, the mother may be pumping, but the man is at home doing the feeding, which in our case, my husband, we were completely equal, and he took 6 months off, I took 6 months off. He was feeding our baby as much as I was, using either pump milk or formula or whatever, that bond happens just as much with a man. And that actually what does happen, and what I agree with Debora, is the person who starts out, when you have your first child, both of you are just like, oh my God, what do we do with this thing? I mean, right? You're both terrified. You have no idea what you're going to do with this baby. But you figure it out. And there's a kind of great sense of competence that comes from figuring it out. It's like, I can do this, I've got this. But that happens for a man as much as it does for a woman. Except that the man doesn't get the leave. And he's not expected or valued when he does that. In fact, I think if we let men be caregivers in the same way we let women now be competitors, we will discover that, in fact, guys bond with their offspring or their parents in the same way. In my marriage, as my husband has often pointed out, he's the one who thinks to call home more than I do. He really does. I'm sort of completely in the moment, and I'm working. It's Andy who says, I call home. He's incredibly close to our sons. I am too. But the more I look and the more I see fathers who are taking care of kids, and to go to the uber elite, I was just at the Most Powerful Women's Conference, the Fortune Most Powerful Women's Conference. There were all these CEOs there, and I asked the women in the audience to raise their hands if their husbands were stay-at-home dads or primary caregivers. So they might have had a job, but they were primary caregivers. 1/3 raised their hand. Just completely understandable. To be a CEO is 24/7, and somebody's got to be home. I think those men, if men are allowed to be the caring, loving human beings that they are, competition used to be socialized out of us, not anymore. Care is socialized out of them. We do not value men as caregivers. We value them by how much money they make and what a good provider they are. But I think there is no biological evidence that men cannot be just as attached to their loved ones as women can be.
Well, thank you very much. I think we will open this up to all of you, and I would like to start with Yasmin Ergas. I think we have several mics. We have one over here. Do we have a hand mic as well? No? Okay, Yasmin, if you don't mind. If you could.
Not at all. All right, so my first instinct is to say I'm so pleased to see that, well, first of all, thank you all very, very much. And secondly, I'm so pleased to see that a conversation about gender and work and family is not a marginal conversation, that in fact everything that all of you have written and all the discussion of the past year and today's event shows the centrality, in fact, of these kinds of issues. So that's just as an aside. But what I did want to say was it strikes me that the combination of all your books and the work that you've put forth is really about restarting a conversation, a collective conversation on how we want to deal with issues like work-family balance. But not only that, I think it's a conversation that especially, well, all of you have addressed in different ways, about ways of being and about how we structure those ways of being and the difficulty also of choices that women in particular have found themselves making, whether they decide to go for the sort of full-time career track and the consequences that that may have in terms of determining their care abilities and responsibilities, or whether they decide not to go for the full-time career track. It's really about ways of being and about the structures within which we make decisions about our ways of being. So it seems to me that one of the important partners or interlocutors for the conversation has to have to do with public policy, the people who are making public policy and shaping the structures of our everyday lives and therefore determining how we can navigate our individual choices. And so my question to all of you is, supposing that in the next administration, just by way of hypothesis, you are the chief gender strategist.
Please, I'm going back to foreign policy.
Exactly. Well, it's easier, I think.
Syria, anyone?
Yeah, not so much.
So, and that you've decided that it's really important to look at the lives of professional women because we've invested so many resources in enabling the development of professional women. What is the policy area or the cluster of policies that you would focus on? How would you address questions like the balance between regulating the workplace and thinking about the provision of care? And what about how you would stimulate a broader public conversation about gender and the roles that we eventually assume? So,
First on the policy piece.
about ways of being.
All right, I'll start. So, this is a very U.S.-centric answer. Let us remember that, we are one of 4 countries in the world that does not have paid maternity leave, and the other 3 are Lesotho, Swaziland, and Papua New Guinea. So let's start with that. Until we have paid family leave, this is just impossible, right? You're really asking people to reproduce, and let's remember, this is our social capital, right? This is our future. We're talking about all those kids, and we are not allowing people, and women have to work, right? 70% of women are in the workforce. They have to have dual income families, and we are making no provision for those children, for somebody to be home. They really are. They can't raise themselves. So paid family leave is the place I would start. And if it were me, I would do what Norway and Germany have done, and I would make it so that either parent could take the leave, but that men had 2 months or more, that if they didn't take it, they lose it. Because the impact of that, at least in Norway, has been a real culture shift. The Norwegian foreign minister told me that companies in Norway are starting to say to men who don't take paternity leave, "What is the matter with you?" And that's exactly where we should be. Like, what is the matter with you? You just had a child and you have 2 free months and you choose work over that? There is something the matter with you. That's not somebody I would hire. And that's what I mean about valuing care. It means, what kind of human being are you that you would have a baby and not take it? So that's what I would do. The second thing I would do is to have high-quality, accessible daycare. I would probably offer tax credits for on-site daycare, but I would make that an absolute essential, and elder care as well, right? Because again, we're forgetting that we're an aging society. It's you can choose to have children, you can't choose to have parents, and so when I say daycare, I don't just mean for children. So those 2 things, and probably the third thing I would do, although it'd be interesting, Alison, to hear your reaction to this. Britain has a law that makes it illegal to discriminate against part-time workers. And I've been told that this is changing the culture of flexibility stigma. In other words, that you are less stigmatized if you work flexibly, which means part-time or from home or however it is. I would certainly do something to try to combat flexibility stigma, so that, because I see the problem in terms of women's leadership, not as women can't, and men who are caregivers don't have the policies. It's if they take advantage of the policies, as I said, they're knocked off leadership track. So I think those are 3 areas that I would work.
I'll come back to the law in a minute. I have been feeling very European sitting here. Yeah. I mean, I have to say, we have maternity leave. We don't do breast pumps in LaGuardia.
Much more civilized.
So, and yes, if I were in charge of gender policy, to be truthful, honestly, the professional women would not be my top priority either. But I will come to a very specific thing about them at the end. My feeling is that you have to give families some support in getting leave for care when they need it. I don't think it's about job site nurseries. They only fit people who work 9 to 5, and most of the poorest people in most countries are working horrible 24-hour type shifts. It's about giving people some flexibility and when they can actually call in a right to be away and give care, whether it's for children or whether it's for elderly people. And I suppose, like everything, once you've had it, you realize it isn't the answer. And maternity leave is great, but actually I'm not sure that the first 6 months is really to me, is not the big deal anyway, whereas actually having an opportunity for either men or women to have a right to paid family leave when they need it seems to me to be really important. I mean, the other obvious thing, looking at the US, is that the other thing that's a problem here, and this is, I think, why you have the most full-time working, is just your healthcare policy. I mean, the thing I took away from your book, $3,000 a year on contraception. Are you serious? To a European, this is... What? So that doesn't mean that there aren't all sorts of things we get wrong too. But I do think that the flexible care, because it goes to anybody, would be to me the most important thing. But actually, if I were going to try and do something for professional women, what I would set up is a really high-powered task force that would find a way of shortening the ever-lengthening length of formal education. It seems to me that the most anti-female thing that has happened is that more and more people have to get postgraduate qualifications, and the time it takes to get a PhD is getting demented. Now, you hit a PhD coming in from one end with a biological clock coming in from the other end, and I'm sorry, it's a car crash. And so if I was going to try and help professional women for the future, I just think we are spending demented time on education, and that is partly the self-interest of academics, and partly a sort of what Lewis Carroll called a Red Queen race. You run faster and faster to stand still. And I actually think it's a serious, serious issue for professional people and what they are taking into sort of young adult life.
I will agree with just about everything and just add a few little twists to it. I love the idea of mandatory paternity leave, and totally agree with the fact that it's not the first 6 months that are actually the issue. Because I always say, and so what do you have let's imagine that we had fully paid maternity, paternity leave for 6 months and a guarantee of your job back at the end of it. What do you have then? You have a 6-month-old, and life has not gotten easy. So, child care is an 18-year adventure. And many parts of which are more complicated than the first 6 months. So I think we need we do need maternity, paternity leaves for infant care, but we need some kind of flexible time bank that you can use it because your teenager's getting in trouble and you can't outsource them anymore, because your mother's gotten sick, because your spouse has gotten sick. I think we need some kind of a time bank. I don't know that that's a federal issue. I think that it's not clear to me the federal government in this country can do anything right now. So I'd rather see some serious work done at the state level or even within organizations tackling this problem. I also think child care and daycare is a huge problem in this country. We're way worse than the Europeans on this. We're worse than many Asian countries on this. And I think we could do some interesting things with tax incentives. I also think we can do some interesting regulatory changes. I know in a past life we actually did look into setting up a daycare center on site. It's actually really complicated because all of a sudden you have to become a licensed daycare provider.
Yeah.
So if you're IBM, you actually can't be a licensed daycare provider unless you go through another whole set of regulatory hurdles. So there are things we could do to just facilitate more on-site childcare. And then finally, and this one is complicated and gets right to the core of Alison's argument, we have a crummy workforce in this country for providing child care. We don't pay our child care workers enough. We don't pay our nannies enough. We don't have health care for our nannies. I mean, I had nannies my whole life and always paid their taxes and their Social Security. It's another 20 hours added to your life just to do the paperwork, to try to do the right thing for a nanny. Let's make that easier. I mean, I know when you talk to women in Hong Kong, expat women, they don't want to leave Hong Kong because it's actually much easier to get domestic care. And I'm not saying that Hong Kong domestic care workers have everything they should, but just look at what's going on in another sector of the economy. Today, we have the high-tech sector lobbying for differential immigration rules for high-tech workers. Why not differential immigration rules for home care workers? It goes back to Anne Marie's point of we just don't value care.
Right. Well, thank you. Why don't we have a few more questions? If I could invite Professor Wax, who I see. Yes, I'm sorry, seems only one.
Actually, because my questions are quick, I'm going to ask a couple. The first is to ask the panelists, how essentialist are you about the potential for equal female representation in the uber elite? That is the kind of jobs that Professor Slaughter did assume in Washington, the people who are very tiny layer, but they are going to be the leaders of society, given what are potentially the inherent demands of those positions and the difference between men and women. Can we pretty much expect men to dominate in those fields? The second is, aren't we being very pie in the sky about equal male-female participation in child rearing? Perhaps anecdotally, a few men take on an equal role, but is it really realistic to expect the broad run of men to start out with an equal role, especially given that in growing segments of our society, men are just abandoning their children?
Do you want to go first?
All right. They're very, very good, and they're tough questions. I'm not usually an optimist, but I'll be an optimist on your first question. I think we should hold out as a goal 50% participation even in the tippy-top spheres of power. We're at about 15% right now across sectors. If you look at congressional reps, board chairs, CEOs, we're about 15%. CEOs is a bit lower. I think we should aim for 50. I think there's no question anymore that women can do those jobs. They can't do those jobs 50% if they're also doing more than 50% of the child care. So we're going to have to see women who either have stay-at-home husbands or primary, other primary care providers. And just totally second what Anne Marie was saying, we don't brag enough about husbands or men who are the primary care providers for their children. Women don't brag about that. We need to brag about it, as Anne Marie has done, and celebrate those choices. We will see women who don't have children in those jobs. We need to brag about them too. Not every person has to reproduce, and we need to celebrate that. So I think we can get there. It's going to be hard. Sorry, your second question.
Is it pie in the sky to have?
Oh, pie in the sky to have men doing primary child care? Yeah, I think it's a little pie in the sky. Full stop.
Okay. Right. Well, I guess, as you all have predicted, I'm not as essentialist probably as either of my neighbours. I don't care if we get to 50%. Among the things that I'm really dreaming of for the future, 50-50 at the very top is not the thing that really dominates my horizons. I'm actually much more personally interested in the bottom, really, where I feel that society is giving an awful lot of people a terrible deal. But also, I actually think that probably 40% is realistic for a combination of reasons. First of all, women can do it. Secondly, there is absolutely nothing to stop you doing it if you don't have kids, and many people don't, or if you do it in the second part of your career. And thirdly, because at the very top, there will be people who are happy to have a husband or find a husband who actually does the primary childcare. But those men are going to be a tiny minority because the vast majority of women, either because they don't want it or because they don't think they're going to be CEOs or whatever, show no interest whatsoever in having house husbands. The number of people who are actually men at the top who are doing primary care is tiny. Really tiny. Most of the men who are the ones at home, the ones who are taking the major role in childcare, it's because actually they're unemployed, their jobs aren't very good, they've had to take early retirement or pull back because they're not well. And so I actually think that if you sort of think about most professional women, they are going to continue, as they always have throughout history, to want men who are at least as successful as them and maybe like your mother, just a tiny bit better. So there will be, if you're talking about the uber elite, I think my own hunch, which I'd even put a bit of money on, is 50 years from now, stable 40-60. 50-50, I don't see it.
Okay. So the first place is I really do care about getting to 50-50 for the following reason. One of my colleagues has done wonderful research on how much of the federal budget would you allocate to social and health policy, care, the infrastructure of care. And you take a group all of men, and you get about 20% of the federal budget. You take a group of men that is under a third women, and you get 20 to 25%. You get a group that is over 40% women, and it goes up to almost 40% of the federal budget. And of course that's right. I mean, if we actually had a Congress that was 50-50, do you really think we would be spending this much on the defense budget and this little on children? No way. So, I mean, this is empirical work she's done. I'm not making this up. And I'm not an essentialist that believes, well, all women, automatically, want to do soft care stuff. I mean, obviously, I do national security, but I do think, and I think maybe there are many men out there too, but if you just look at what women say when they're allowed to be themselves rather than pretending to be men so that we can get ahead in a man's world, you get a very different set of things. So I do care. When I see women at the top, they manage differently. I also think we just need diversity. Diversity. We ought to have a leadership that reflects the people we are. So that's and I am optimistic. I'm optimistic because in the first place, as I'll say in a moment, I do think men can change. And as I said, you got a third of the women who are CEOs now who have men in those situations. I think men themselves are changing. I also think as our lives elongate, the Janet Yellen or I hope Hillary Clinton. Janet Yellen is head of the Fed at 67, and why not? She's got 20 years, a good 20 years she should expect. Or if Hillary is elected, she'll be 70. Great. I know a number of women who are starting to run for office after their kids have grown, and why not? We can expect to work happily till our mid-80s. If you're 22 today, you have a life expectancy of 86. That means a third of you will make it to 100. I mean, if we don't have second and third acts, I don't know what we're going to do. So I think I see some very positive trends. But let me come back to this idea of men. I mean, this is just extraordinary. I just feel like I'm imagining that I am a woman trying to convince a group of men in the 1960s that a large number of women will become chief breadwinners. And they're all going to go, ooh, that will never happen. Women aren't breadwinners. Women are caregivers. Women aren't competitive. Remember, we didn't think women were competitive until Title IX. Right? So this idea that you all are all deep male essentialists. Men won't take care of their kids. Well, we didn't think women would be doing the things women are doing. We've had an unbelievable cultural shift in terms of what femininity is. You know, there are men out there who think I'm feminine enough to marry. That would not have been true, right? And so really, the whole idea of what being a woman was, being feminine was socially constructed. And we as women bear this responsibility, because it's not just men who look at other men and say they're less masculine if they're caregivers. It's us. We say, and Deborah, you said it, we're out there, we want a guy who's a little smarter, a little tougher, and a little more successful than we are. Well, we're never going to get to the top if that's what we want. I mean, forget it. You have to be able to say that, you know, a man who is a competent, loving caregiver who also has any number of other attributes is a wonderful man. And look at that, you know, I think we're starting to see it, because if you look at People magazine and you look at Star Treks, now I'm really showing my petticoat here, my intellectual petticoat. You know, what do you see? You see Brad Pitt, you see all the stars with their kids, right? You are starting to see these, you know, role models, these celebrities with their kids, increasingly equal time. I'll leave you with the following. What was more emblematic of housewifery than the laundry detergent commercial? Right? We all grew up with laundry detergent commercials. Tide, there you were, the woman, my clothes are spotless because I use Tide. Okay, so now there is a Tide commercial with Drew Brees, who is the quarterback for the Saints. And he says he is standing in front of a washing machine. And he says, sometimes I think my family off the field, meaning his kids, get dirtier than my family on the field, meaning his NFL teammates. But I use Tide. This is an NFL quarterback holding up a thing of Tide. And then he says, as his two little boys run through, because I'm the equipment manager around here. Now that tells you a lot. A, it tells you Tide thinks there's a market for stay-at-home dads, right? They're not doing this for women. They're doing this because they think they're marketing. There's a group of men out there. Second, the idea that he says, I'm the equipment manager, you know, that's really telling. You know, he doesn't say, I do the laundry. He thinks about it in male terms, like a coach would, right? And yeah, our houses may turn into sports camps. I, for one, am perfectly fine with that. But I ask you to challenge your own imaginations.
Okay. We're out of time, but we have lots of questions. If I can have your indulgence to just collect maybe two more questions and let you each have a final word. Could I invite you and I think we have to give one man a chance.
Yes, I think so too.
He may be the only man here.
No, he's not. No, there are quite
More than that. They're about 10.
They're about 10.
So let me just introduce myself. I'm Judith Shulevitz, and I'm with the New Republic magazine. And speaking of books on this subject that have been overlooked, in 2005, there was a book that came out called The Time Divide by Jerry Jacobs and Kathleen Gerson, I believe a labor economist and a sociologist. And they documented the ballooning workday, or let me put it this way, the way in which the workday was ballooning. Even as women were beginning to enter the workforce, in the top 15%, let's say, I don't remember the exact figure, the workday was expanding the white-collar workday was expanding from your average 9-to-5 job to a 50-hour week, and that's on average. We all know that the sort of higher up you go, the longer that week actually is. And then you had the rise of the dual career couple. So you had these couples working average 100-hour weeks, right? And so it seems to me that one of the biggest problems you face as a woman attempting, or a man, a would-be caregiver, let's put it that way, attempting to enter the workforce, is how do you balance these two jobs with this ballooning work week? One of the things they mention is that white-collar workers were exempted from the Fair Labor Standards Act. This is where I get very American-centric. So that is one of the things that allowed the white-collar workforce to be subjected to this kind of norm. It's not necessarily a law, it's simply a norm. So I wonder if in working on your books you came across this sort of time-bind, as Arlie Hochschild would put it, issue, and what policy recommendations you would have for it.
And if I could invite you to go up to, so that we collect these last questions.
Okay, as part of the designated minority, I will ask a question which tees off something that Deborah said about being the only woman on the room or one of a few women in the room, and I find myself in that situation, obviously, inverted. So my question is this, or two questions. One, why are there so few men in this room, literally and metaphorically, literally in this room and metaphorically, in the discussion? And probably more importantly, how do we get more men in the room?
So, thank you very much. If we could just invite all of you to give your final thoughts on both of these questions, or those aspects you wish to engage, starting with Deborah.
Yeah, so I'll start with Adam's question, which I think is spot on. One of the things I always look for when I'm giving talks, particularly corporate talks, is how many men are in the room. Because if there's no men in the room, the corporation's not serious about what they're doing. We have to bring men into the conversation. And I think that goes back to the earlier point, why I think we need to get closer to 50-50, is we need the diversity at the top to have a truly diverse conversation. Men, if men just sort of push the women's problem over to the women's networks and the women's panels, it's a disaster. So I love seeing, I can never quite guess relationships, but when I look at an audience like this, the young men who are sitting here in the room, who may have come with a friend, who may have come out of curiosity, I always say to my students, bring your male friends along to the conversation. Men are uncomfortable entering the conversation by themselves. Women have to invite them in, and they have to come. In terms of the time bind, I agree entirely. And the data I looked at is a little different than the one you cited earlier. The data I saw is that women are still working 33 hours a week, U.S. data, on home care, in addition to everything they're doing in workplace. Men have gone up from about 17 minutes a week to about 7 hours. Big percentage change, much smaller absolute. So it's a crucial problem because at the end of the day, it's just the math. And I'll just finish by citing, I was talking to my colleagues earlier, there's a Norwegian study that just came out that's looking at the impact of Norway's mandatory paternity policy and seeing whether it could work in the U.S. And they conclude by saying the paternity policy has been good, but what's really allowed for greater equality in Norway is that the Norwegians work a much smaller work week, much shorter work week. I don't know that we can legislate that, but at the end of the day, it's just the math. There's not enough hours in the week for two parents to be working two big jobs and still do childcare. It's just impossible.
Okay, a lot of it is the math. The answer as to how they do it is they hire other people to do it. This is why we have a huge new servant class, because the reality is that how they do it is they hire people in. And what is happening is not that we're getting a shift from women doing all the care to men doing all the care. We're getting a shift to a far more shared life, but it's one where you buy people in to help, and that's how you help. And what is interesting is that it's the elite whose hours have gone up. If you look at the 19th century, poorer people work more hours. Today, it's that top 15% who work the extra hours. They hire other people to do it, often on horrible shift stuff, but that's the reality of how they do it. And in terms of the math, I'm not saying that men do as much housework. I'm saying when you add up the numbers, and what I did for this was I looked at a huge number of countries, and there are some other kind of interesting quirks, as well as the Italians polishing their tables. But if you look at the numbers there, what is interesting and the dynamic behind it is that there is this movement to a total number of unpleasant hours, or hours which, aren't about lying on the beach. You, of course, would say they were purely pleasant hours because work is what we all want to do. I actually think about getting men in. How many women here would have gone to something in which the main title was Men and? Yeah, so I actually think a few of us would, and a few men did. So I do think that, in a sense, it's about both sides sending maybe inadvertently a signal that the other is not welcome. And I did something just before I came to the US, which was for people in the IT industry, which is actually a very intriguing industry because it's one where actually female participation has gone backwards. And they are seriously interested in this and seriously concerned about it. And because it was IT first and everything else second, it was a genuinely mixed audience. So I do think that maybe both of us need to be clear about the very powerful signals that words can send.
So on the question of hours, to two things. I mean, one, yes, it is important to remember that the workers at the bottom don't have enough hours, right? These hyper-flexible schedules where you get 15 hours a week rather than enough hours to actually to support yourself. So I think that difference is very important. The other thing, just because Liza Mundy isn't here, and I think it's important we haven't talked about it, right? Her work shows in the middle class, right? It is women who have the jobs and men who do not, right? The men do not have enough hours, and that's an enormous shift. Again, why I think men's roles are changing, because the numbers of jobs are in eds and meds. They're in more traditionally female professions, which are actually caregiving professions or care professions. So I think that's important to remember too, that we're talking about the elite, we're talking about the poor, and the experience of middle-class women is very different. So the last thing on how do we get more men in? And I think there are two ways. I mean, this is exactly why I frame this debate in terms of care and competition rather than in terms of women or in terms of even work and family, which I think for many people is code for women. But I really do see it as not valuing care. And as I look around, I think that explains much of what we see better. I think if you talk about care and competition, that's a more neutral frame. But the other thing that I've found there's two things. One, millennial men, I think, are changing on their own. I mean, I now have students at Princeton who actually say, I want to be a stay-at-home dad. You know, that just was unthinkable. That may be anecdotal, but it was unthinkable. I can't even imagine it. So I think there are changes among millennial men, but here's how I frame it. If I had daughters, I would be raising them with more choice than I am raising my sons. Because if I had daughters, I would be raising them to believe they could be breadwinners or caregivers or any combination of the two, and they would be valued by society. Raising sons, I'm basically raising them to say you have to be breadwinners. Now, maybe in my household, since they've always grown up with a mother who's put more money on the table than dad does, their life strategy may well be to look for a wife who can support them. But my point is, in terms of social norms, it used to be that, girls didn't have choices. We had to get married. And now we have all these choices, and it's boys who actually are still socialized only one way. So I think this debate really has to be about real equality. And many men wrote me and said, you think men have it all because they have families and careers, but we don't get to see our families. We don't have it all either because we want to be much more with our families, and we are not. And I did not understand that. I thought that was just rationalization. But I have come to think, if you really think the good life is a blend of what you achieve in your sort of independent self and the love we bear each other, then I think men are not equal either.
Well, I think I want to thank all of you for coming. Please join us for a light lunch. There's some great new books you can buy out there. And what a wonderful discussion. Please join me in thanking our interesting and distinguished group.